It's a great pleasure for me to speak to you all here in Korea. Feminists in Europe and the US are very much aware that something remarkable is happening here. A powerful women's liberation movement has been created which is making change on many fronts. Radical feminists in Korea are challenging harmful beauty practices and men's sexual violence in inventive ways, and it's having an effect. It's wonderful for me to be able to make a contribution to this movement with my books that have been translated into Korean. On many issues, Korean feminists are creating new ideas which inspire me. But I'm going to talk to you today about an issue which is just beginning to emerge here, transgenderism and the transgender rights movement, but which has already created a crisis for feminism and women's human rights in other countries. I wrote my book, Gender Hurts, a feminist analysis of the politics of transgenderism, published in English in 2014, because I have become more and more concerned about the ways in which the ideas and practices of transgenderism were harming whole constituencies of women, men, and children, and damaging any chance of feminist revolution. Transgenderism, I argued, hurt many. To begin with today, I'm going to talk about how transgender politics developed. I will look at the history and suggest that gender dysphoria and the idea of gender identity are harmful inventions rather than constituting some real and natural condition that adults and children might have. Then I will talk briefly about some of the ways in which transgenderism hurts many people, those who transgender, the wives and partners of men who transgender, children who are identified as transgender, and women's human rights. What is gender? Sex is biological, and gender, which is socially constructed, consists of 6 stereotypes which set out the qualities that are assigned to women and men under male domination. Sex stereotype used to justify women's oppression by saying that women's oppression is natural. The ideology of transgenderism says that persons who transgender are essentially endowed with something called a gender identity, which consists of the mental and behavioral characteristics culturally assigned to someone of the opposite sex. Without the idea that there is such a thing as a feminine gender, transgenderism could not exist. There would be nothing to trans. Transgenderism comes from and represents male domination. This is what makes the notion of transgender rights an arrow at the heart of women's struggle and takes us back to the 1950s, when women were seen as a separate category of persons who were naturally suited to being an underclass. The stratification of society on the basis of gender creates the scaffolding of our oppression, and feminists seek to abolish gender. Transgenderism, on the other hand, seeks to rehabilitate gender and provide it with rights. Persons who transgender are diagnosed as having, or simply proclaim that they have, something called gender dysphoria, because their gender, whatever that is, does not match their biological sex. The problematic nature of this diagnosis is clear in the fact that heterosexual adult women do not get gender dysphoria, or at least it is extraordinarily rare in such women. If this diagnosis was identifying a genuine condition, then heterosexual women would get it too. In fact, there are no media stories about heterosexual women who create psychological torment for their husbands by saying one day out of the blue that they're really men, running around the house in Y-fronts and demanding to have gay sex with them. This does not happen. But it is the absolutely common story of the vast majority of men who transition. They are heterosexual men with a sexual fetish for stereotypical women's clothes. The minority of men who transition are homosexual men who do not feel able to love men whilst they have male bodies. The women who transgender are overwhelmingly lesbians who do not have a sexual fetish, but may suffer from despair at being in the oppressed and degraded category of womanhood, or feel that if they love women, they must really be men. The big difference between men and women who transition is that men are trading down and women are trading up in social status. And quite different social and political explanations are needed to explain this. The social construction of transgenderism. Transgenderism is socially constructed. The concept of transgenderism was, as the US anthropologist David Valentine put it, institutionalized in the 1990s. Valentine is an anthropologist, researched communities in New York in the mid-1990s that had been identified to him as transgender by the AIDS outreach organization that he worked for. He was surprised to discover that none of those in these supposedly transgender communities identified themselves as transgender. They were gay men involved in prostitution who adopted attire more usually associated with women, but saw themselves as men and as gay. They had not caught up with the new language and categorization that social service agencies had already adopted. There was a time lag. Rather than these men identifying themselves as transgender, they had this category imposed upon them. Medicine creates transgenderism. The major force in the construction of transgenderism was the medical profession. Men who cross-dressed occasionally were called cross-dressers or transvestites. The idea that some men, those who wanted to imitate women on a more permanent basis, were a special category of persons called transsexuals who could actually change their sex, only became thinkable as the result of developments in medicine in the 20th century. Endocrinology was the medical specialism which played the most significant role, and the two most influential doctors who advocated for sex changes in the mid-century were the endocrinologists Harry Benjamin and Christian Hamburger. Endocrinologists developed expertise with hormones, which were originally, in the first few decades of the 20th century, introduced into the bodies of men who wanted to improve their virility by the insertion of goat testes. Later, artificial hormones which mimicked the natural hormones produced by the human body proved more efficacious. These hormones were used on intersex patients, whom the sexologists considered should be made to resemble more closely the sex category into which the doctors had placed them at birth. Then they were used on patients who wanted to change sex. Another medical specialism needed to be at a particular stage of development to enable the plastic surgery to be performed, and this was anesthesia, which enabled the third medical specialism that enabled transgenderism, plastic surgery, which provided the expertise to perform the mutilating surgeries. The sexologists were conservative men, the enforcers of male domination, who believed that homosexual men must have some element of femaleness in themselves, that they were not real men. As a result, they exercised their skills at changing sex on homosexuals. The first man to be subjected to surgery and hormones to make him into a woman in the US in the 1950s, Christine Jorgensen, was homosexual. He was persuaded by his doctors that he was really a woman because this was the belief of many medical men who were hostile to homosexuality at that time. In the 1950s, doctors set out to cure homosexuality because it was seen as a disease. And amongst other barbaric treatments, lesbians and gay men were given lobotomies to change their minds. In Iran today, homosexuals are subjected to harsh punishment, and the only way they can avoid this is by being transgendered by the state. This form of violence is still happening today in the West, as almost all the girls and women who are transgendered are lesbians, and a minority of the boys and men are gay. Autogynephilia. The majority of men who transgender, however, are not gay, but heterosexual. And I will explain that this behavior is caused by a sexual problem called autogynephilia, or the love of the woman in oneself. Before the 1990s, transvestites or cross-dressers were seen by the sexologists as having a sexual perversion or paraphilia, which caused them to be sexually excited by wearing what they saw as women's clothes. Most medical professionals today, however, have changed their mind about men's cross-dressing under pressure from a transgender rights movement. They no longer talk about it as a paraphilia, but use the language of gender identity. In order to gain social responsibility, cross-dressers need to hide their sexual motivation and pretend that they have had some mysterious but real transformation into women. They need to be respectable, to realize their ambitions of practicing their sexual fetishes in public places, such as women's toilets, where they can force women and children to be the unwilling audience for their sexual games. They cannot make the public play along and facilitate their fantasies if their interests are clearly just sexual. They need respectability too, so that they can get medical treatments on health insurance or from public health systems, which would not be forthcoming for sexual fetishes. For this reason, they promote the idea of gender dysphoria and the idea that a man can have a woman's brain in a male body. Some sexologists, though, have never changed their minds. They maintain the understanding that transgenderism is not about an essence of femininity, but sexual, and they use the term autogynephilia to explain this. On the basis of having studied and treated these men and collecting their fantasies and testimonies, they say that they seek masochistic sexual excitement by engaging in imitations of women in a variety of ways. One group of autogynephiles is interested only in what they see as women's clothes. They might only want to wear women's underwear, probably frilly and uncomfortable, under their work suits. Or they may want to walk out in public looking like a porn star. Some of this group will have a past as teenagers when they were snowdroppers, meaning that they stole women's underwear from washing lines to masturbate on. Another group likes to engage in what practitioners see as women's activities. Some like to knit, for instance. Others in this group will visit prostituted women and demand to be forced to do the housework while dressed in a pornographic French maid's costume. These men will not do any housework in their homes because they see it as degraded women's work. Another group of autogynephiles seeks to emulate women's biology. These men like to pretend to menstruate by using pads and red ink, or by seeking used tampons in the women's toilets and stuffing them up their bottoms. Others wear rubber female bodysuits, either just a vulva or a whole bodysuit, in which they will stand in front of a mirror and fondle their rubber breasts, for instance. The most dedicated seek permanent physical alteration by using hormones or having amputations, and these are the ones who would once have been called transsexuals. Almost without exception, these men seek to censor any suggestion that they are doing these things for sexual reasons, because that might inhibit the sympathy of the public. Men who transgender are likely to have other sexual perversions as well, called co-paraphilias. These may include a clearly related paraphilia called apatemnophilia, or body identity integrity disorder, in which men are excited by the idea of being amputees and seek to have legs amputated. One man who calls himself Chloe Jennings White, real name Clive, has a female gender identity, but also a paraplegic identity. He is very fit and a mountain climber, but wants to find a doctor to break his back so that he can be paralyzed and experience this excitement of being trans-abled, as he calls it. He presents as a woman in a wheelchair, but is in fact an able-bodied man. The co-paraphilias may include nappy fetishism, in which men engage in which they call age regression and may imitate babies in nappies, and even demand that their women university lecturers or social workers change their soiled nappies. These male behaviours are written about in the media as fascinating but mysterious, and the sexual motivation which explains them is never mentioned. It should be quite clear that these paraphilias are a male problem. The sexologists recognize that women do not get sexually excited by fetishism in the way that men do. The transgender rights movement. Though some critical sexologists and feminists like me still see men's cross-dressing as a sexual problem, a huge change has taken place in the last 3 decades. From understanding men who cross-dress as practicing a sexual perversion, to seeing them as really women who should be recognized as such in the law. A fetish has become a human right, and this is the result of the development of a transgender rights movement. The impact of the internet. An important force in turning a sexual interest into a rights movement was the internet and the industry of online pornography that it enabled. The early movement in the 1960s did not have access to the internet, but campaigned for acceptance through their groups and magazines. In the age of queer politics, the internet was developed and enabled various groups of hobbyists, as these men often call themselves, to form communities online and promote their paraphilias. The internet enabled an influential community of cross-dressers to proclaim themselves to be women and demand their rights. They were aided by the fact that many of them were nerds high up in the tech industry and able to use the technology to great effect and in a way that feminists could not match. The online pornography industry encouraged the creation of hobbyist groups for men who specialize in particular perversions or paraphilias. There are groups for men who like to be in tight corsets, as well as groups for men who like to wear nappies and pretend they're babies, all for sexual excitement. Many of these groups and specialist websites were for men interested in various aspects of cross-dressing. 10% of the pornography industry is devoted to men's cross-dressing. And this is likely to be a reason why so many more men are determined to act out this fetish in public now, compared with a couple of decades ago. The pornography demonstrates the sexual motivations of these men. It features feminization, in which men are reduced to the status of women, often through magic potions, sometimes by being captured by aliens. There is bimbofication, in which men are reduced to the status of bimbos, and age regression pornography, in which men are made into schoolgirls. There is pregnancy pornography, in which men become massively pregnant, and lactation pornography, in which men lactate or suck the hormonally induced breasts of trafficked and prostituted Thai ladyboys. A cursory examination of the pornography makes the sexual excitements of this cross-dressing really clear. The moment of greatest sexual excitement, the money shot of pornography, is that at which a man is forced into a lower status by having lipstick applied or being required to don a girl's school uniform. Pornography has encouraged cross-dressing fetishism and is likely to be connected to the great boom in men coming out as transgender, including ones who keep their penises and their beards. The men involved are increasingly going public, seeking sexual excitement by thrusting themselves onto an unwilling audience by appearing in women's clothes in public places such as women's toilets, for instance. They may demand that a woman in a women's toilet shake their hand whilst they are dressed, because this will cause them to ejaculate. The online resources created a community that could coalesce into a political project. Online there were, alongside a specialist pornography, hundreds of websites offering advice and products such as frilly knickers with a hole for the penis, or training videos on how to get a woman's voice or way of walking. The online community of cross-dressers had gained sufficient confidence by the 1990s to turn their sexual interest in imitating women into a rights demand. They have been so successful that their gender rights, i.e. the rights to wear fetish clothing and pretend to be women, have become enshrined in law and policy in countries across the globe. The campaign to see men's crossing as a right to gender identity began in the US in 1995, when a couple of American cross-dressers created a wish list which they called the Bill of Transgender Rights. One of them was a heterosexual married family man who was an occasional cross-dresser and organised weekends away at which men would dress. The other man was a more persistent cross-dresser who became a judge. The first right in the bill states that all human beings have the right to define their own gender identity, regardless of chromosomal sex, genitalia, assigned birth sex, or initial gender role. The other rights concern these men's posturing as women in public spaces and women's spaces, and their right to cosmetic surgery to acquire their desired body shape. The bill said that everyone has an internal sense of gender, and this makes gender essential and compulsory. I don't have a gender, and I suspect that most of us here today do not either. That which feminists sought to abolish has come back with a fury and is now being adopted by governments into law and becoming compulsory. In the 1990s, the early Bill of Rights from a couple of unknown US cross-dressers was not influential, probably unknown to feminists, and not recognized as a potential threat to women's rights. But it provided the template for what became, in 2007, the Gender Identity Rights section of the Yogyakarta Principles. The Yogyakarta Principles is a document originally created by international legal and human rights activists to promote lesbian and gay rights. The coup the cross-dressers were able to accomplish was the piggybacking of their sexual fetish rights onto the rights of lesbians and gay men, so that cross-dressing rights of heterosexual men came to be seen as an integral part of lesbian and gay rights and inseparable from them. The Yogyakarta Principles, though not a UN document, are increasingly influential. Wherever the principles are adopted by policymakers in the EU and by governments, the rights of cross-dressing heterosexual men to pretend to be women are included. This means that any increase in the rights of lesbians and gay men are likely to reduce or eliminate the rights of women. This angers me as a lesbian because I am keenly aware of the need for lesbian and gay rights to be protected and would welcome a set of principles that I could promote and be proud of. There are many examples from around the world that I could give of the way in which lesbians are being subjected to extreme violence or even murder. In South Africa, for instance, lesbians are regularly subjected to what is called corrective rape by young men who think they should be punished and be forced to be heterosexual. Even in the UK this summer, there have been attacks on lesbian couples by groups of men in London and in Bristol. How gender hurts. Once the ideas and practices of transgenderism were normalized and promoted by transgender rights activists, by a queer and postmodern academia, and by a complicit media and right-on lefties, it had a wide range of very harmful effects, particularly on women and girls. The mass delusion that men can be women is harmful to both those who transgender and all those they come in contact with, but also to feminism itself and the very idea that such a thing as a woman actually exists. Transgenders themselves. The constituency most directly and immediately hurt is that of the men, women, and children who are transgendered by the medical men and the chemical companies through what used to be called gender reassignment. Gender reassignment is now supposed to be called gender affirmation on the grounds that the person is already and always has been their gender of choice and is impolite to suggest otherwise. There is a continual massage of language by transgender activists with the object of making their proclivities look more and more natural and respectable, and those who do not catch on to the new language in time can be accused of transphobia and anti-trans hatred if they get words wrong. The doctors and drug companies make a great deal of money, and that is their main motivation. The doctors, psychiatrists, counselors, endocrinologists, and surgeons all gain considerably. But the biggest profits go to the drug companies, who gain a captive and dependent market for their drugs and have increasing numbers of people, commonly from childhood onwards to the end of their lives, forced to use them to keep their bodies functioning once their natural systems have been destroyed. Those who transgender suffer serious harms to their health, including sterilization from the surgeries and drugs. They are also sold the lie that transgendering will cure their distress and their mental health problems when it does not. And they may suffer social isolation, inability to find work, and have no relationships for a lifetime. Transgenderism is an immensely harmful and invented condition which should not be supported by an ethical medical profession committed to doing no harm. Wives and partners. Another constituency that is harmed by transgenderism is that of the wives and partners of men who transition. These women have to cope with their husbands and male partners saying that they are actually women, though they have fathered several children and been men for 50 or 60 years with all the privileges that brings. The men demand lesbian sex with their wives, are dominated by their fantasies and entirely selfish, spend large amounts of money on party dresses and absurd shoes, and meanwhile refuse to help with the housework because it might damage their fingernails. The wives, mothers, and children are likely to suffer a sense of loss and severe mental distress, but are expected by therapists to accept it because these men are seen as going on an important and brave journey in their wives' and sometimes their daughters' knickers. The wives usually leave if they're financially able to, but have to put up with the husband's fury that they do not remain supportive handmaidens of the fantasy. It may be dangerous for them to leave. In 2016, a cross-dresser in Ireland killed his wife and 3 sons because his practices, such as dressing in his wife's underwear, were about to become public, and he could not bear his family to know about them. Children. Another group hurt by transgenderism is that of the children, mostly girls, and almost entirely same-sex attracted, i.e. lesbians, who are being transgendered in support of the transgender ideology. The adult male transgender activists promote the transgendering of children because that makes their practice more respectable and less obviously about sexual fetishism. If children do it too, they think, that makes it look more innate. The children at younger and younger ages are put on harmful drugs to delay puberty, which causes delays in brain development, sterilization, loss of bone mass, and likely a catalogue of other harms as yet unknown. When they have body parts amputated at 16 or 18 and are put on hormones, they will suffer many other harmful health effects, such as the inability to have sexual feelings or function, and be dependent on drugs for physical functioning for the rest of their lives. In 5 years in the UK, the numbers of children being presented at the Gender Identity Clinic at the Tavistock increased from 468 to 2,519 a year, a rise of more than 400%. Lesbians. The effect of transgenderism on lesbians is particularly severe because the practice eliminates lesbianism. Increasing numbers of lesbians, particularly very young lesbians, are being encouraged to believe that they must really be men because they love women. Back when I became a lesbian in the 1970s, It was common to attack lesbians by saying they just want to be men, or were really men, as in the film. Now there is a war on lesbians, in which serious violence is carried out against their healthy bodies in order to make them into men. Lesbians who are transgendered suffer conversion therapy to make them chemically and surgically constructed heterosexuals with serious harms to their health. The transgendering of lesbians harms their female partners and any children they may have. When lesbians transgender, they deny the lesbianism of their female partners and force them to lie and pretend that they believe the women they love are men. In fact, transgenderism forces many people to lie, because the great majority of the public do not believe that people can magically change their sex, but they are under pressure to pretend that they do believe it. Children that lesbians who transgender give birth to suffer from the lie too. They are simultaneously deprived of a mother and forced to pretend that their mother is their father. The children born to women who are in relationships with lesbians who have transgendered are lied to as well, because they have to accept that their mother's partner is their father, and increasingly this lie is being written on their birth certificates. In the practice of transgenderism, lesbians are being subjected to forms of prejudice and medical violence that should have long been extinct and belong to the dark ages of medicine and eugenics of the late 19th and early 20th century, well before a feminist and lesbian movement created the space in which lesbians could be proud and strong. There are promising signs that the transgendering of lesbians is being challenged, as increasing numbers of young lesbians are detransitioning, i.e., realizing that undergoing drugs and surgery to try to be men was a mistake, and coming to accept that they are in fact women and lesbians. These young women, who are speaking out on social media, on marches and rallies, and at public events, speak about the psychological harms they have suffered and physical harms in the forms of breast removal that create unsightly and uncomfortable scars, the loss of sexual sensation, permanently lowered voices, change their hair distribution and a masculine presentation, which can make it hard to be accepted again as a woman. They talk about how hard it is to have to continue to be men with male names in workplaces, because they have already committed themselves to building careers as if they were men. But they are smart and brave young women, some still teenagers, who have committed themselves to challenging transgenderism as an ideology and practice. They are a hope for the future. Fight back. In the years since I wrote Gender Hurts, a considerable feminist resistance movement has arisen in the UK and several other countries. Feminists are forming groups, giving many public talks, influencing the media, challenging government policy with some success. There is a great swathe of activity. One part of this is the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. This year, 2019, a group of women in the UK, of whom I am one, the Women's Human Rights Campaign, put together the declaration to combat the ways in which male cross-dressers are threatening women's rights with their fetishist demands, and to be an antidote to the influence of the Yogyakarta Principles. The declaration reasserts that women have human rights and that they are based upon sex, not gender. Women's rights as human rights were set out in the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, in 1979, which stated categorically that women's rights are based upon sex. There was no transgender rights movement at that time, and no confusion between sex and gender. The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights describes a number of areas in which gender rights conflict with the rights of women. Women's spaces. Women's human rights have at their basis the dignity and safety of women. At this time, cross-dressers are asserting in law their right to enter all women's spaces, such as women's toilets and changing rooms, shelters, and rape crisis centres. And the Declaration argues that this constitutes discrimination against women. All of these spaces are set up as women only in order to protect women from male predation. And the entry of men is leading, not surprisingly, to violence against women and girls and sexual assault. The examples of this violence by cross-dressers is piling up, and I don't need to give a detailed list of examples today, but they include young girls being assaulted in toilets, women prisoners being harassed and assaulted in women's prisons, and women being harassed in store changing rooms. The problem in prisons is so serious that in Britain, a separate prison, just for cross-dressing men, has been set up inside a women's prison to protect women from them. 50% of the cross-dressers who are in prison are there for sex offences, compared with 19% of the general prison population. So this is a particularly dangerous group of men that is gaining access to a place where women are confined and particularly vulnerable. Women's rights to social and political participation. CEDAW asserts that women have rights to participate equally with men in politics and social life. It states, too, that it is reasonable for states to use special measures, such as quotas, to enable the political representation of women. The idea that women should have political representation is being made a mockery of in the UK, with the inclusion of cross-dressing men as women's officers in branches of the Labour Party, and in women-only shortlists for selecting electoral candidates. Women's right to participate in sports, which had to be fought for strenuously throughout the 20th century, is now being overturned by the inclusion of cross-dressers in almost all women's sports at this time, including athletics, football, rugby, cycling, boxing, cricket. This has led to the winner's podium for these sports, sometimes including men at both first and second place. Women are losing the right to college scholarships and the right to win sporting competitions. More than 5,000, in fact more than 6,000 women have signed the Declaration, and they come from 80 countries. It is being used in many places to challenge governments and policymakers who are trying to enshrine the rights of cross-dressers. Please do sign individually and on behalf of any organisations that you represent. The threat to feminism. There are many more areas in which the intrusion of men with a sexual fetish for women's clothing endangers women's human rights. As well as overturning the most basic of sex-based rights that feminists have fought for over decades, transgender activism challenges the very basis of feminism as a movement and creates great obstacles to the possibility of women organising to protect what they have gained or seek any further change. The struggle to abolish gender, or what were once called sex stereotypes, i.e. the idea that there are certain qualities of mind and behaviour that are natural to women and men, is fundamental to feminism. CEDAW states that sex stereotypes must be eliminated because they are so harmful to women. Transgenderism cannot exist as an idea or practice without protecting and promoting precisely these stereotypes, now called gender, which puts it in direct opposition to the movement for women's liberation. Transgender activists seek to change language in ways which make it impossible for us as women to talk about our experiences and campaign for our interests. The word woman itself is ceasing to have any meaning. The activists say that women should call themselves cis women, just one variety that is no more significant than the men who call themselves trans women. They seek to prevent women talking about their bodies by erupting with fury if women mention periods, the men being jealous because they do not have them. They require organizations set up by women, such as those that support breastfeeding or mothers, to adopt gender-neutral language which suggests that men can do these things. They enforce this compelled speech legally. A woman who was attacked by a male transgender activist in London in 2017 was told by the judge at a trial in which her assailant was convicted of assault that she must refer to him as female and use female pronouns out of respect. Judges and magistrates in the court system have been directed to bully women in this way, and the effect is to deny girls and women the right to speak what they know to be the truth, to accurately describe violence against them, and to give evidence. Women are denied equal access to justice. Transgender activists oppose women holding meetings without them and harass and threaten venues. They seek to take over women's organizations and publications so that women can be forced to change their agendas to centralize men. They speak for women, appearing in magazines and on panels as women to give women's point of view. They pursue feminists who criticize them, seeking to silence them with threats of rape or death. They use social media to dox them and seek to get them sacked. These furious men have a great reach into many state agencies, into legislatures, and into many countries. In the UK, they have trained university staff, the police, the Girl Guides, government departments, the National Health Service, through their organisations such as Stonewall, which was once a lesbian and gay rights organisation, but now focuses on cross-dressing heterosexual men. This is a degree of influence that feminists have never had, and is being described by feminists in the UK as an example of state capture, in which organisations with special interests are able to take over the organs of state and create policy. They are powerful because they are a men's sexual rights movement, and supported by men in positions of power internationally, as well as by powerful corporations, powerful individual male philanthropists, and drug companies. In one way, the rise of a transgender rights movement has helped feminism. The behaviour and demands of men who cross-dress are now so egregious that many, many women are being stirred to fury and are creating a new feminist movement. It is still hard to believe that a movement created to promote men's masochistic sexual fetishism has become such a threat to the possibility of women's freedom. But the rage it is creating is welcome and promises much.